Want to welcome you all here for the Space Power to the Warfighter Breakfast Series that NDIA and AFA and ROA are sponsors. I'm Peter Husey, and I'm going to be very brief. Just to let you know, on May 1st, Colonel Grodin is going to be talking about range issues. Congressman Bridenstine, who are our guest this morning, is going to be speaking on June 12th about the threats to our space assets. On July 10th, we're going to have an ORS briefing. And then on July 31st, we're going to have General Greaves going to be speaking about launch issues, and then General Bush on September 11th, and I'll let you know beyond that, but please, we'll be sending out invitations on that. Also on Friday, Madeleine Creedon is speaking from NNSA. Next Tuesday, Senator Hoeven is speaking on triad and nuclear deterrent issues, and then on the 1st of May again is Colonel Grodin, which we will send out invitations as soon as I get back to AFA and do that. And so without anything further, I want to welcome all of you, our sponsors. I want to say particularly a hello to my boss, General Deptula from the Dean of the Mitchell Institute, and Kath Ryan, who is my colleague and friend who helped me put these together. And I'm going to introduce now General Teague. Would you please join a warm welcome to General Roger Teague.
Well, good morning, ladies and gentlemen. It's great to be with you all this morning. Thank you all for coming out and joining us in a special Mitchell Institute breakfast, space breakfast this morning, as we pay tribute to and bid farewell to Lieutenant General Ellen Pawlikowski as she gets ready to transition here very soon and pin on her 4th star and head out to be the commander of Air Force Materiel Command. And so I think this morning's certainly appreciate the Mitchell Institute, General Deptula, for organizing this and allowing us to hear from General Pawlikowski one more time. It's certainly a great moment and very, very appropriate. I would like to also welcome Congressman Bridenstine. Sir, thank you so much, not only our professional staff, but personal staff here. We know how busy you are. We're right in the midst of markup season. We know they're taking great care of our space programs, and we've had such a great working relationship over. My staff has certainly enjoyed the professional relationship over the last year with so many that are here this morning, and we look forward to continue doing great things together. So thank you so much for being here, sir. Rather than going through a typical biography with General Pawlikowski, I was asked to say a few words, and rather than kind of go through her impressive list of accomplishments and background that we all know and love and appreciate so much, rather than doing that, I thought I would share a few tidbits about her that you may not know. And right now she's like, "You're dead, Roger." So yes, this is I don't know, I'm taking a step forward here out on the edge. Yeah, could be career. Is there anything good here could happen? I don't know. So here goes. General Pawlikowski, first, she is about to become a grandmother for the first time. Next week, I will tell you, she is very excited about that. She carries her iPhone with her, and if you haven't seen the pictures of her grandbaby, she will show them to you very proudly. She can't wait. Her daughter, Jen, is going to give birth here, I think, very soon, and so we're very excited for her on that. Secondly, you may not be aware, but she is a heck of an athlete. General Pawlikowski has taken up, just for fun, just to kind of keep in shape, running half marathons. And she's done so for the last couple of years, about every 6 weeks or 6 or 8 weeks or so, just to keep in shape. And that's just absolutely incredible. But third, and I think everyone in this room in some big way or small way could probably verify that General Pawlikowski really goes to extraordinary efforts to take care of her people, to take care of those that she associates with, both directly and indirectly, to form the kinds of relationships that we all need, that we can all, if you will, from an enterprise perspective, be very, very successful. And it's those kinds of little things that make her such a great leader. And so we're very, very grateful, not only for the way that she mentors us, she takes care of us, but we know that that's what's going to make her so successful as she gets ready to assume the command of Air Force Materiel Command. Congressman Bridenstine has got a few words, but I need to as well. I know you all are very familiar with Congressman Bridenstine, representing the 1st District of Oklahoma, and the great things that he is doing for us in our national security space enterprise. I've got a tidbit on him that you guys might not be aware of. And we're very proud. You all know his service in the U.S. Naval Reserve, flying E-2C Hawkeyes. On Monday morning, he was just sworn into the Air National Guard, which we're very pleased about, sir. Thank you so much. Welcome to the Air Force. So if I may, without further ado, ladies and gentlemen, introduce Congressman Jim Bridenstine, sir.
Well, it's an honor to be able to introduce General Pawlikowski today. She, of course, as everybody in this room knows, is the military deputy to the Office of the Assistant Secretary of the Air Force for Acquisition. I first met her, goodness, it must be well over a year ago at this point, when she was the commander of the Space and Missile Systems Center at Air Force Base, Los Angeles. But, you know, looking into her bio, she's pretty impressive. Chemical engineering from New Jersey Institute of Technology. She was a ROTC student there, and then after that she went to Berkeley to get a PhD in chemical engineering. Now, I don't know how a ROTC student ends up at Berkeley. I'm sure after class she probably protested herself. Needless to say, I'm sure she went there because of the wonderful chemical engineering program that they have there, and certainly it's a credit to her for having done so. Some of her other duties include the Deputy Director of the National Reconnaissance Office, Commander of the Air Force Research Laboratory, and of course Commander of the Space and Missile Systems Center. Interestingly, as she puts on her 4th star and becomes the Commander of Materiel Command, that's very relevant to me because we have Tinker Air Force Base in the great state of Oklahoma. So I look forward to continuing having the opportunity to work with her. And this has been a tremendous opportunity for me to get to know her. I'll tell you, as a freshman member of Congress, sometimes it's very difficult to figure out where you fit in, where you can be effective. Brand new, 435 members. How can I, as a brand new member of Congress, fit in and be effective? And I can tell you that when I made my trip up to the Space and Missile Systems Center in Los Angeles, I think I found that niche. There was an area that seemed like maybe there wasn't a whole lot of attention being paid by members of Congress. Certainly on the Armed Services Committee, we're all in tune with this. But it was her leadership, some of her words, and some of her leadership that ultimately enticed me to get more involved in figuring out where I can, as a member of Congress, be helpful. She's got a great vision. She's made big changes. And of course, the political support that comes with that is very important. So without further ado, General Pawlikowski, thank you for speaking to us this morning.
Well, first of all, Congressman Bridenstine, thank you for that introduction, and Roger will talk. I couldn't help but reflect a little bit in listening to Congressman Bridenstine and his comments about going to Berkeley from a small conservative engineering school in New Jersey to the University of California at Berkeley was quite a cultural change. But one of the things that you reminded me of, sir, is that when I got to Berkeley, the ROTC students, their class was at 7 o'clock in the morning. And the reason their class was at 7 o'clock in the morning was because they could go home back to their dorms and get changed out of their uniforms before they went to class. So that was the environment, not dissimilar to the environment that I lived in when I went to downtown Newark, New Jersey, to go to school, wearing my uniform. Can you imagine the reaction, the feeling I had in, let's just say, roughly 2005, 2006, when I walked through an airport in my uniform and had somebody walk up to me and thank me for my service? That's how much this country has changed in terms of the view of our military and our contribution to the society. What a difference. So thank you for that little trip down memory lane, Congressman, because it did bring home, one of the things that's near and dear to me, and I'll talk about this a little bit at the end, and that's our all-reserve force and our total force and just how important that is. But today, Kathleen tells me I'm supposed to talk about our budget. So I have these prepared remarks from Roger's staff, so let me begin. Okay. The Air Force total space budget in FY16 President's budget is $8,192,465.23. It is 6.95278% of the Air Force total FY16 budget. Of that, $5,492,764 is spent on space investment. And then the FIDEP, that is $28,185,723.42. Wait a minute, is this really what you wanted to hear this morning? You know what, how about if I, instead of talking about this, I talk about what one might call what I did on my summer vacation, or the G version, since this isn't an unclassified setting, of the Space Strategic Posture Review and what that meant to what you might see in the Air Force FY16 budget submission. What do you think? Is that a better than, or I can read some more numbers to you. All right, so let me go ahead and do this. And as I caveat it, I have to caveat this that, there's a lot of aspects about what happened in that review and its implications that I really cannot talk about in this forum. So for those of you that are very deep in these things, I apologize if what I present to you is a little simplistic, but I think it's something that will help us all to understand the framework and what really happened this summer as we went through this review. First, let me start out by saying, I know those of you who've been in this business for, Ray, another space study, right? We're always doing at least half a dozen of them at any given time. But I will put it to you that this was different. And this, in my mind, was the first real look in a broader sense and with a broader audience than just amongst us space folks of the space environment and what it meant to us as a nation. Since the Rumsfeld Commission, which really focused on some of the organizational things. But what we did, the basic premise of this strategic posture review was to say, okay, let's understand what are we doing in space, what should we be doing in space, and what is that environment look like today versus where we were even 5 years ago. So in other words, what's the threat look like? How are things going? And I think next time you're going to talk a little bit about the threat, Congressman. So this will kind of be a preview. He may be able to tell you more secrets than I can, but I know I can't. No, none of us want to, like I said, we all want to leave here without our hands behind our backs. So that was the basic premise of it. And it was a broad-reaching review in the fact that when we looked at the capabilities from space, we also asked ourselves, is there another way to get that capability? Do we have alternatives, particularly if we're in a threatening environment, so that we can, as anyone who goes into whether it's a military operation or you're buying a new system, you always like to have backup plans, contingency plans. And so we looked at this not just at space, but the connections to space and how could we possibly do that. So what came out of this, I think there are three things that I would like to highlight in terms of the results. And many of you have heard me say this before, but now I can say it with the stamp of approval of the leadership of not only the Department of Defense, but the SPEAR results were actually discussed beyond just the Department of Defense, throughout the executive branch too. And that was, space is here to stay, get over it. It's important for us to do exercises like a day without space. But when you look at how integrated our space capabilities are in all of our national security missions and all of our capabilities, precision navigation and timing, communication, ISR, weather, all of them are an integral part of how we operate. But even more importantly, when we looked at it in the sphere, it isn't just national security. It is an integral part of our national economy and to a great extent of our international economy and the way we live and the way we conduct business. PNT. Can't have ATMs without it. I know we like to block that off, but think about that. You know, without access to space, there are so many things that we cannot do. And why is that important? Not just to recognize that it's not just protection of our, enabling our national security from space, but this is a broader context for understanding what we need to do with space, because now if we start to talk about being able to respond to threats in the traditional mode that you would have seen in space, we hunker down on our individual systems. Protected SATCOM. SATCOM is protected against jamming and intercept. And we do that to protected SATCOM. Commercial SATCOM, we never worried about it, right? Now we have to look at this a little differently, because that space environment is not just operating as national security space operations. And every day it grows to a bigger part of the international economy. Look at the recent Google and SpaceX partnership. About 2 years ago, I was invited to speak at, I can't remember the name of the conference, but it was a major venture capital conference in Los Angeles. And I was surrounded by venture capitalists that were seriously looking at spending money in space. I put it to you, 10 years ago, there would have been crickets in that room. So I think the biggest thing out of this first one is it's not like, oh, ho-hum, we've heard this before. This is different. When we look at space, we need to look at space much like we do the sea in terms of, or air, in terms of our responsibilities in the Department of Defense to not only ensure that we can operate in space, but that our country and indeed the world can operate in space. So that changes. So that was the first one. The second one was, again, you've heard me say this, but once again, this is into the broader audience of this is no longer a big space where everybody can just kind of do what they want and there's no threats to us. We've seen the demonstration from the Chinese. We know about, we've seen the issues associated with jamming and spectrum interference. We can no longer assume that we will not be in some way engaged in protecting our capabilities in space against attempts to deny us those capabilities. And just as we rely on space, our adversaries also do. So this is an area that I can't get into detailed specifics on, as I think you can understand about what we're going to do about this. So let me describe for you with an analogy about how I view how the department's looking at this. And this analogy is an Ellen Pawlikowski personal one, but I think for me it's the best way that I can describe for you. If you're living in a city, and our city now is space, and you talk about protecting yourself, you don't treat it as if you got to do it all on your own. There's a security force, a police force, and that police force has many different things it does. There are cruisers that go around and they tour and they protect. There's SWAT teams that are capable of responding. There's cyber forensics experts that do all that, and that is paid. That is the community force which is provided by the government. However, if you are a bank, you're going to build a vault in addition to counting on what this police force will do. Now, if you've got a department store, you may you'll alarm it, and you know how quickly that the police force is going to be able to respond. So in much the same way, when we look at how are we going to protect space, there's going to be some level of community protection that the government is going to need to be able to provide and define. But everybody that operates in space is going to have to think about this and is going to have to work on this. And we're going to have to work on it collaboratively. Because if you're a commercial SATCOM provider, you've got to understand what we're going to provide and what you need and make your decisions about how you're going to ensure that you can continue to operate. Now, we're going to be interested in it because commercial SATCOM turns out to be a very, very important part of our national security posture. So when you see play out some of the things that play out in the budget and some of the focus that we're going to have, that's really the basic context. It's a recognition that, okay, there's some things we're going to have to do to make sure that we can operate in space and that we can protect our forces on the ground from particular aspects of what somebody else may be able to do in space, or our capabilities on the ground, I should say. And in that context, it's going to be a mixture of things that we will do in this community environment, things like GSAP, which you've heard about, which is our patrol car, if you will. That's going around and checking on things and making sure where they are. But then there will be other things that may not be government provided, and how that splits up is going to be part of the discussion. You know, for example, we have the JSPOC, which is a critical part, the Joint Space Operations Center, which is a critical part of how we orchestrate and understand what's going on in space. There's something called the ComSPOC, which is an AGI product, but in which they are collecting data for situational awareness and essentially selling that to whoever's interested, but say commercial SATCOM providers, so that they can use that data. So part of this dialogue that's going to need to take place between the citizens and the government is, you know, where does that, you know, how do we most effectively do that together? I think that's a really critical thing that comes out of it. Because that brings me to what I see as the third most important thing that we learned out of this, is that we need to be better engaged in international cooperation and in our engagement with the commercial side. So those are the three things that that we see. That's Ellen Pawlikowski's, like I said, G-rated version of what came out of the Spear. So what did that mean in terms of what you might see in all those numbers I was going to read to you? Well, I think what you will see is sometimes you might say, oh, it's a continuation of the same. And that's only partially true, but it is true in the fact that, remember premise number, item number one that came out is that our space capabilities are an integral part of what we do. So therefore, we better make sure we're continuing to modernize GPS. Now we're continuing to provide the 24 to 30, whatever the number is of the number of satellites to provide that coverage. We better, but in addition to that, for something like GPS, we need to look at the user equipment. So you might see a little more focus on user equipment about, you know, how do we leverage the fact that we're not the only PNT satellite in the sky. Can we use other international assets to bolster up, provide diversity, and therefore improve the resiliency of our PNT? There's an example of what I'm talking about. So you're going to see, and then that's an area, by the way, where maybe from a national security, we may want to have some very small but localized backup to the loss of GPS. But recognizing all along that GPS is a global commodity that we can't ignore. We can't just, the National Department of Defense can't just go in and say, okay, we're not going to worry about GPS, we're going to go develop this other capability to do precision navigation and timing because we're concerned about loss of GPS from jamming. We can't ignore GPS because that is a service that is so critical to us. But we may do some things, say in GPS, that would enable us to be able to deal with, you know, in a contested environment. So now let's look at SATCOM, which is one of the ones that's most near and dear to my heart because I've been working on that for about 10 years. You will see that we're going to continue to pay for the investment we have in advanced EHF because strategic comm is absolutely a critical part. But there's a recognition, back to my first thing, that we need to look at comm in a bigger spectrum. We need to look at it, as I told the Satellite Industry Association, Congressman, you were there that night, we need to look at this more seamlessly. We got to stop stovepiping that. Okay, we've got commercial SATCOM, we've got protected SATCOM, and because I got to tell you, ladies and gentlemen, those soldiers, sailors, airmen, Marines, and Coast Guardsmen that are out there, they don't care whether they're talking through an advanced DHF satellite or an Intelsat satellite. All they care about is that they can continue to talk and that they can get the information that they need. So you will see a continuation, but some morphing of it based on the input from the SPEAR on our efforts in the protected tactical waveform. And I believe that that protected tactical waveform, which is protection that is nowhere, not as good as what you would get from advanced DHF, which is designed to provide our communication to our strategic forces when it's really, really bad, right? But it will provide better protection than you would get from using a commercial without any protection on it. And then we can also use this waveform to go from, we can actually potentially ride it right on the commercial SATCOM signal, if you will, as it is today, all the way to a unique protected tactical waveform, all the way up to something that's a combination. So you're going to see, as we continue the analysis of alternatives for protected SATCOM, more activity in that area about how do we best do that, how do we do that blending. Also, better ways to be paired up with our commercial providers. There's some pathfinders in there that look at a better business deal. But you know, that business deal is important, but the other piece to this is, again, you remember that community interaction with the citizen. How by the relationship we have, the business relationships we have in commercial SATCOM, can we better provide more resiliency and protection for our comms? So that's what you'll start to see. You know, we have SMI lines that some of you have heard that term. You're going to see the focus of those get more refined and honed in as we go through that. OPIR, or in the general sense of ISR, you're going to see us investing in SBIRs. But you're also going to see us continuing our investment in things like the wide area STERA, right? Roger, I always get this mixed up. Yeah, wide field of view STERA, which allows us to, a la the next generation of what we called CHIRP, which was our hosted payload. And I can't tell you today whether that's going to be something that we will host, but you can see that when I talk about continuing to want to build this relationship between commercial and international, that being able to leverage more of what's up there in space has some benefit in terms of this community protection activity. So that will continue to play in our AOAs. But I will also tell you that both the analysis of alternatives for protected SATCOM and for the OPIR are well informed now from what came out of the SPEAR in terms of what are the other things that we can do besides disaggregation, which you know you have heard Doug Lavero and I talk about now for 4 years. But there are other things that we now are a lot smarter about that will enable us to provide better resiliency. And so what you're going to see is those play into those next architectures. What are the other types of things? And I'm not going to tell you what those are, because that's like giving you the combination to my safe. Because I know, you know, Amy's going to want to share it, and Aaron's going to want to share it, and Mike's going to want to share it, and I don't want to share it because we don't want to give them the combination to our safe, right? So when I get generic like that, let's just say that, you know, there's a lot of different things we're going to be doing that are going to provide that protection. Okay, so that kind of covers, so you can see that covers the service we provide. Now let's look at that protection force and what we need to do that. Well, fundamental to anything we would do to protect our assets in space is knowing what's going on there, right? Because without knowing what's going on, you're just shooting in the dark. So we need to get our night vision goggles. We need to get our cruisers out there. And you know, and we need to get a better way of pulling all that data together and analyzing. So you will see in the budget there is an increase in the JSPOC mission systems, which is the system that, the software, if you will, that we use, and an emphasis now to get beyond just cataloging data so that we know, we know where all these pieces are, but moving into, shall we say, command and control of our satellites. And you may have heard from General Raymond that he stood up a commercial cell within the JSPOC. Once again, that's a move towards better engagement between the commercial side and the national security side. The next discussion comes up is, when we talk about command and control, how are we going to do that? Because, the FAA can call you and say, don't go in that airspace, or, move over here. What's the role between commercial entities and the JSPOC? And is that the right role for the Department of Defense? Right? So those are the types of things that we have to work through as a community, not just the national security, but the entire community. Let me see. I'm not going to talk about anything more in that area. I mentioned the ComSPOC already. I think that's an excellent example of where, well, what I will do is I'll talk a little bit about where international and commercial may play into everything I just talked about. And I did that a little bit along the way. In the international environment, in 2015, the United States of America does not have a lock on all of the smart people in the world. There was times when we had the best high-performance computers, and we had the best in terms of manufacturing capabilities, and we could put our heads down, lock everybody out, and come up with the greatest breakthroughs. And now in the era where cyber doesn't require a whole lot of investment, to be able to do that, where we have university students that have spent their time here and gone back to their countries, to our allies. So right from the beginning, we need more international cooperation in terms of research and development and technology development. The second is more cooperation in terms of leveraging each other's assets. You may have seen in the press that we recently signed an updated agreement with the French about space situational awareness. In the commercial environment, I've talked about that. Everything from how do we figure out how we work together as citizen and police force, if you will. Hopefully we can do that and recognize and not get into and recognize the value of diversity as opposed to opposing what might happen there. I think we will. I'd have to say, particularly from my own personal engagement, the relationship between the commercial space business and the Department of Defense has been very good. And most of it's been the Department of Defense getting a better understanding of what they need and how they fit. And I think that this SPEAR was a real eye-opener for a lot of folks that had seen space as a national security environment, and oh yeah, we had these other satellites around here that wanted to make sure they wouldn't get in our way. Well, that's no longer the case anymore. Those aren't just those are part of what we need to be out there protecting. So on the commercial side, I think you will see us trying to understand better the commercial practices in the acquisition side, so we can, you've heard Boeing in particular, Craig Kooning, say, I can get you a commercial SATCOM satellite in 28 to 32 months, and it's 60 months for WGS. Why is that? They're both SATCOM, and we've gotten that down. You're going to see more and more of that. You're going to see us more leveraging what's going on in the commercial market and leveraging the commercial capabilities, much like we've done in SATCOM, but as these other, and international. The Germans have a radar sat. The Israelis have a radar sat. Kepler doesn't allow you to only circle around your own country or your own part of the globe. So there are plenty of opportunities for us to use and leverage as we sit down and figure that out. So those are the kind of things that you're going to see more and more of as we go forward. And I could go on, but I'm going to stop there, and I'm going to bring us back to something I talked about in the beginning. This is, as Roger talked about, this is probably one of my last space talks. I did one out at the National Space Symposium, so I apologize to those of you who were there because you probably heard some of the same things. But what motivates me here, and it's something that I think should be motivating all of us. When I first got into the space business in 2010, I couldn't even spell satellite. I could do that now. But I also really didn't have an appreciation to what this capability meant to me as an airman. I can tell you I understand that today, and here's what it boils down to for me. We are a nation of volunteers. For 40 years, millions of Americans have volunteered to put themselves in harm's way to protect our freedoms. This generation, that are our young soldiers, sailors, airmen, Marines, and Coast Guardsmen, grew up with cameras in their cribs to monitor them, with cell phones even as early as toddlers, with tracking where they could tell where their friends were, instantaneous information from anywhere in the world, collaboration at their fingertips, and situational awareness that those of us with gray hair never dreamed about ever being able to have. And this is not just something that that is additive to them, and if it's gone, they know how to cope without it. It's an integral part of how they think, how they interact, and they are our true force multipliers. GPS isn't. Oh, the ISR we have isn't. It's their ability to take that information and use it. That's what makes our distinction. So these young men and women are voluntarily, many of them citizen soldiers like the congressman here. We cannot let them down. We cannot let them go into harm's way without having those things that make them who they are, because they are that because of how we brought them up. So when my granddaughter Zoe steps for the first time in 2037 to her F-35, I want her to have the best space capability that we can provide to her so she can protect me in my old age. Okay, thanks. You have time for questions? Wait.
Thank you. Thank you, ma'am. Amy Butler with Aviation Week. Forgive me, I'm going to ask you the sort of cynic's question here.
I wouldn't expect anything less.
well, I'm not Colin, but I was around for the Rumsfeld report. I remember a lot of the optimism that came out after the Rumsfeld report. Of course, we were plunged into Iraq shortly thereafter, so a lot of the initiatives tended to fade. I'm curious what you think is different about now that makes these initiatives, and you're speaking of breaking down a lot of barriers, not just in acquisition practices, but also cultural barriers to make these things happen. What's different now? Why should we believe this will take hold?
Well, I believe that the things that we've talked about will take hold because of the necessity of it. The cultural change you talked about, I talked a lot about that, but I didn't use that word, but you get the theme. I mean, that is the most important thing that came from this. And if we don't make that cultural change, we will be fighting World War II in 2030. So I think what you will see that's maybe a little, I mean, you kind of referred to it. You said Rumsfeld happened and then we went to Iraq, and so things changed. But we aren't the same as we were before Rumsfeld. And a lot of it was because we had to adapt and we had to understand what we needed to do there. Now as we look out and we look at the threat, which Congressman Bridenstine's going to tell you all about next time, we have to make these changes, much like we had to go from cavalry to tanks. You know, otherwise we'll be the Polish army greeting the Germans on our horses as they come in. We can't, and we recognize that. So now cultural change is never easy. But I put it to you, we can do cultural change. You know, Kathleen wanted me to talk about this today, and I chose not to, but, you know, when I got to SMC back in 2011, the focus, as you know, was performance, schedule, and cost, whatever it took, right? We knew we could not continue to do that. And that was a cultural change for SMC as much as it was anything else. But it came with providing the right tools and helping people to learn how to do it right and convincing them that we could become more affordable without sacrificing performance. So it comes with leadership, which we're seeing from the DepSecDef. You probably saw some of the press that came out from the Space Symposium. We're seeing it from Secretary James. We're seeing it from General Hyten. I hope you're seeing it from me. That's what it starts with, and then providing the right tools. And that, I think, is the critical thing that you're going to see happening. I mean, we, like I said at the Space Symposium, you know, we lost a third of our budget, but not a single production satellite. We did that by being smarter buyers and making sure we understood what we were paying for. That was a huge cultural change from we got to do it this way because it works this way and we don't want to lose a satellite, right? And that was how we did it. So cultural change is not easy. It took 4 years, or 3 years, right? And I'm not saying this is going to happen overnight, but it's got to happen.
Colin Clark, Breaking Defense, morning.
Good morning.
There's clearly been a major shift in the last 4 to 6 months. The language of all the Air Force leaders and space leaders makes this pretty clear in terms of the threat and how you're going to deal with it. I know you won't tell us many details, but can you describe how significant this shift is and how much the White House bought into that? And I think that'll do.
I think the recognition that it has to be addressed is very significant, Colin. You've reflected it in terms of what you've seen in terms of the remarks. How we do it. I mean, I don't think you're going to see an FY16 budget. It's just like I said, the FY16 budget at first glance looks like it's more of the same, right? And so you're going to see that we can't, just like in any place in the military, I can't throw away all the AHF satellites and build a whole bunch of new things that are different. So you're going to see us evolve. I think what you're seeing is the biggest shift is a recognition of that second piece that I talked about, that we have to put some resources and some focus on this protection capability that is not stovepiped up through one of the functions. I think that's a pretty significant change, Colin, that isn't as evolutionary. But I think you're going to see more evolutionary change, because what has to come along with anything you might see in terms of what we buy is tactics, techniques, procedures, and ConOps, you know, the cultural change we talked about. And that's going to be a focus that is going to take a lot of what I call the iteration that, you know, when we started here today, I was telling General Deptula that Ellen Pawlikowski personally has 2 corollaries that I follow. One, technology doesn't know its application until we tell it. That's on the acquisition side. And we don't know how we're going to use something until we get it into the hands of the warfighter. So what you're going to see happen over the next several years is we're going to go through that cycle. We're going to understand what technology can we have, but at the same time, the Jay Raymonds of the world are going to be looking at, and the Admiral Haney's of the world are going to be looking at what's our ConOps should look like. How do we do this? You know, how do these cruisers interact with the SWAT team? You know, how does it? All of that is not rocket science, but it is, no kidding, taking a warfighter focus to something that we have not necessarily had that kind of focus on before. It's been, you know, provide the capability, so it comes down to the you know, so that I think is going to happen and you're going to start to see more and more on that. But I don't think you're going to see a major shift to say we're canceling, you know, advanced CHF 5.6 because we're going to do something else. You're just not going to see that, because premise number one is we got to have this stuff. So you're going to see an evolutionary change, I think, as we go through. You see some on this AOA, but what you're going to see is some pretty rapid effort that's focused on this cultural change. Because as Amy says, you know, you got to strike when the iron's hot when you're trying to do cultural change. Change agents takes, you know, when you've got the burning platform, which is what you described. We now have the burning platform. That's got to happen. And that's in the hands of General Hyten, General Raymond. The DepSecDef has endorsed it and Admiral Haney. So you're going to see that, because that's and that I think it is a it's an interesting observation for you, because for me, like I said, this was not what I did on my summer vacation, but this was indeed, and it will change as we get smarter.
Does it extend across the space enterprise?
Yes. Yes. And when the Spear results were briefed at the through the National Security Council, not at the NSC level, but below that, and the decision on the budget was an administration decision. It wasn't the Department of Defense's decision. This was an administration decision, which it always is every year, but probably more so in this one, they made those decisions based on, what came out of the Spear. There was a lot of dialogue across the government on this. Not just, as I said in the beginning, not just the traditional space folks, but even in that, this was not, you've heard probably this quote of this $5 billion ad, and of which most of it we can't talk about. Well, that's because it was this was a combination of the intelligence community, the black space as we call, and the white space. This was done mutually across that way, as well as including the State Department and, OMB. So this was an all of government. And now the engagement has started with across the river, where I know that, there has been a number of briefings. I think, Steve, you sat down, for example, with the team and got the R-rated version of this, right? And now that dialogue is happening, so it can really be all of government, right? The summer it was essentially the executive branch, but you will see that.
Good morning, ma'am. Rebecca Cowan-Hirsch from Inmarsat. As you take on your new mantle at Materiel Command, I wonder if you could address the terminal segment. We spend a lot of time focusing on the space assets, which are essential, and yet a great deal of the flexibility as well as the fragility resides in the terminal segment. So perhaps you could address that as part of this.
Yeah, Rebecca, that you hit on one, and I know you and I have worked through this when you were at DISA. Yeah. You hit on what's probably one of the most critical parts when I talk about being able to have the flexibility to cross that segment. This approach has to include, whether it's GPS, or more importantly, the SATCOM side, it has to include the ground in two aspects. First, the command and control system, and second, the terminals more than anything else. And that's going to be the harder thing to happen, but we're going to address it, and the challenges with it. And there's really two challenges when you get to the terminal side, in my opinion. The first is the fact that terminals are bought for platforms. And so oftentimes the decision about when a terminal is being bought and what kind of terminal you buy is not driven by what I put in space, but driven by the platform itself and what its schedule looks like. And when you swap out a radio on an aircraft, there's typically changes that have to happen. You got to put an there may be even a flight profile change, there may be an antenna you have to put on. So oftentimes in the terminal discussion, which Rebecca and I are very familiar with, you end up in more of a discussion about the platform than you do about the terminal itself. And then the other piece is the synchronization. We have not been very good in the past at hitting our targets for putting satellites on orbit. I lived this very painfully when I took over MilSatCom in 2005, when then Lieutenant General Steve Beutel, who was the G6, had a problem. He had to get comm across Iraq, right? And what we had was a WGS that was going to be another year late. So what did Steve Beutel do? He bought commercial SATCOM. I would have done it if I was him too. He had an operational need. That's what was available. WGS goes up. Guess what? The Army doesn't have the money immediately to buy WGS terminals because they just spent all their money on commercial SATCOM terminals. So what was our answer to this during that time? Does anybody remember that four-letter word? Jitters, right? And that was one where the technology and the requirement got disconnected. There was this vision, and that's what I call it, that you could build one radio and just put different software in it and you could do what I've described. The technology wasn't there yet. So if I go through that cycle, the technology wasn't there yet. It was a lot harder than people thought it would be. And as I learned in the commercial side, when I got into SATCOM, particularly when you're talking on the SATCOM side, the modem, if you will, this piece of hardware that software is in and the antenna are not independent of each other. And remember, the antenna is driven by the platform as much as it is by the terminal. Now, pull forward. This is now 2015, and it's hard for me to believe I've been doing this for 10 years, but I have. Now, you know, we're in a better place when it comes to technology. We're in a better place when it comes to understanding the platforms. My personal opinion is the Navy's going to be way far ahead of the rest of us because they have the Navy multiband terminal. And they have the ability to, and they got a whole lot of antennas already because of that multiband. And so they're going to have flexibility to be able to do what I described a lot better than the Air Force is going to be because our program, FAB-T, which was started at the same time, was not as successful, let's just say, as NMT. So it's going to be a lot harder for my Air Force to take advantage of this spectrum broadening than it will be for the Navy. In the Army, I think they'll be somewhere in between because they've got a little more turnover in their terminals, although they use them forever, but in their user equipment than we do. They buy at larger quantities and it may take them a while, but they'll be able to leverage it. So we have to tackle that, and there are, I won't get into elaboration, and Steve could probably tell you more about this than I can. There are a lot of discussions about how should we be organized for SATCOM. A lot of discussions about that. You know, the idea of commercial SATCOM being in one place and military SATCOM being in another place. If we're going to do what I talked about, we got to figure out how to do that better. Now, the relationship between DISA and SMC has always been good, but when you start talking about the requirements and how those get sorted out, and you start talking about the business deal, it gets complicated. And as you point out, it depends on what terminal you buy. My example with Steve Beutel, right? Who made that decision? It wasn't DISA, and it wasn't SMC that made the decision that they were going to buy those commercial terminals. But DISA and SMC had to live with it, right? So there are organizational issues associated with what you said that we've got to work through and understand what's the best way organizationally, because the seams are difficult to cover.
Good morning. Vaughn Stanley, Department of Energy. The GPS wasn't always a military-only system. It was a classified system that, through a tragedy, was made public. I'm wondering your thoughts on something like that's military-only becoming a dual-use system, even, for example, the NDS sensors on GPS.
You know, I only have 10 years of history in space, and I always say this because I'm not a space expert. I say that in 10 years because there's always somebody in the room that brings up something that I have no clue. I think what happened with GPS is what I described earlier. Technology doesn't know its application until we tell it, and you get it in the hands of the user, and I don't think I call it a tragedy because the world economy today, because of GPS, is much better than it ever was. But there are problems.
The Korean airliner that went down.
Oh, okay, okay. There are a lot of things that that have transitioned from the black all the way to commercial applications, and there always will be. There always will be. But I certainly can't speculate on what those might be today. All right, we are. Sorry.
General Pawlikowski, that was an extraordinary tour de force.
Thank you.
God bless you.
Thank you so much.
I also want to say thank you, General Teague, for hosting our event, and Congressman Bridenstine. Always nice to see you, and thank you for coming to speak with us in June. And to my boss, General Deptula, thank you as well for the Mitchell Institute sponsorship of this, and Kath Ryan being my partner in this, and all my guests. And also wanted to say hello to our guests from our foreign embassies that are here today, as well as our sponsors and our Air Force folks, and particularly the people on Capitol Hill who don't get thanked enough from all of us, because you really do your homework and your work to put the Pentagon's budget and the Department of Defense's budget on the right, straight and narrow, which is, and again, General Pawlikowski, Godspeed in your new job. Congratulations on your 4-star. We will be in touch and hopefully working with you again, and would you all give again another thank you to General Pawlikowski.